Hi, my name is Virgil Adkins and welcome to the presentation on Malcolm Knowles, Andragogy, and Adult Learning Concepts. Before we begin, I'd like to ask you to have three things handy for the presentation. The first is your Artifact 3 outline that accompanies the presentation. There are a couple of things that I'm going to ask you to follow along with on the handout itself and some things that you'll be filling in, so please have a pen handy as well. We'll do a little bit of writing. The second thing that I'll need you to have is your comparison chart of Andragogy and pedagogy. You'll be referring to that for part of the presentation. And then the final document that I'll ask you to have is your critique or your evaluation of the presentation as well, so that you may complete that upon completion of the presentation, so that you may submit that as well. So we're going to get started with the presentation about Malcolm Knowles and Andragogy. So I'm going to start with a short story. I promise, very short. Okay? A lot of you know that I served 21 years in the military. When I retired from the military, one of the first jobs that I applied for, I had to do a training presentation because the actual job title was training manager, and I was responsible for training others, which included doing presentations and training presentations for the organization. There were many candidates for the position. I believe I was the last person to be interviewed, and I was asked to do an impromptu presentation on the spot, no real practice or training. I didn't even know that I would be doing a presentation. During the presentation, I happened to remember an article I was reading while waiting in the dentist's office about a gentleman named Malcolm Knowles and his concept of andragogy, which I'll talk to you about in just a moment. But all of the information that I read in the article came back to me, and I was able to actually speak on it and kind of apply it in a little scenario during the presentation for the interview. And the interviewers were so impressed with, one, the presentation itself, and two, my knowledge of Malcolm Knowles and the concept of andragogy, that I was actually selected for the position. So we'll talk about Malcolm Knowles and his concept of andragogy and what it means. Okay? Just as a question to everybody that's present, how many of you know about Malcolm Knowles himself, who Malcolm Knowles was, and what his concept of andragogy is? Okay? Some of you do, some of you don't. So we're going to find out exactly who Malcolm Knowles was and what andragogy was, and also what other adult learning concepts were included in these theories as well. So some things we'd like to accomplish during this presentation. If you'd like to follow along on your presentation that you have, your PowerPoint presentation, we're on the introduction and objectives. On the introduction and objectives, one of the things we like to cover is we like to be able to construct a definition of andragogy. What does it mean? Also, we'll construct a definition of adult learning concepts, and we'll also compare and contrast the tenets of adult learning concepts, the different portions of it. And we'll also demonstrate an understanding of andragogy and adult learning concepts through a short quiz. So be prepared to take a quiz. It means you have to pay attention, be able to answer the questions on the quiz. Okay? All right. Throughout the video, again, we'll ask you to pause your portion of the video so that you may write down your answers. We're going to start with a small centering activity. During the centering activity, what we want you to do at this time is write down your definition or understanding of the word andragogy, what you think it means and what the definition is. So we'll take this time to pause your video, and then you'll write down your definition. Once you've written it, go ahead and resume your video, and we'll review the actual definition of andragogy. Okay, welcome back. All right, so you've written down your answer. Now we're going to refer to our reference guide, which is our course text, which is Learning in Adulthood, a Comprehensive Guide, which was written by Miriam Caffarella and Baumgartner in 2007. And they have a definition of andragogy, which is actually pronounced Andragogy. Sounds like a French word, but it actually is a Latin word. It comes from two root words, which is andra, which is adults, and goji, which is the science of helping adults learn. So quite literally, andragogy is that, the science, the art and science of helping adults learn. So we're going to look at what that means and where it's found its roots and its basis from. Looking at a historical overview of andragogy, it started in the early 1800s as a concept. Many years ago, adults were not the subject of learning. Children were the subjects of learning. Adults wanted to teach children how to learn, of course, how to read and how to write. And centuries ago, there wasn't a lot of effort or concentration on adults learning beyond childhood. So pretty much people went out to work and learning was not a big deal in those days. So once you learned as a child, pretty much learning was over with once you reached adolescence, and you pretty much became a laborer or worker. You did whatever your job or function was. So there was no real focus or emphasis on learning as an adult. There were some individuals that attended colleges or university, of course, but those numbers were very, very, very small. And even then, the concept of pedagogy, or the art and science of helping children learn, was applied during this process versus an adult that focused on how adults learn, which is a far different process and a far different focus, meaning and purpose. So in the early days, andragogy was measured by psychological tests, seeing how much an adult learned or retained. That's still true to some degree, but that's changed a lot as well. So we'll look at a little bit of what the differences of pedagogy and andragogy and what they mean to adult learners. All right. Malcolm Knowles first wrote in an article in 1968, Pedagogy versus Andragogy, which kind of looked at the differences of pedagogy and andragogy, of course, the differences of how children learn and how adults learn. Following this article in 1968, he actually wrote several books that followed based on andragogy and the study of andragogy and how adults learn. So in writing these different articles and books, he came up with 6 assumptions for learning, for adult learning. Malcolm Knowles' 6 assumptions for adult learning. His very first assumption was that as a person matures, his or her self-concept moves from that of a dependent personality toward one of being a self-directing human being. It's kind of a long title, but let's look at what that means in reality. As a person matures, they're no longer a child. They're no longer sitting in a elementary or junior high or high school classroom. Now they're an adult, and they're more mature in their concept and their thinking and their concrete thinking, abstract thinking. So they're moving towards being more of a dependent person, less of a dependent personality, more of a self-directing human being, meaning they provide their own goal, purpose, and direction. What do I want to do with my life? What do I want to accomplish? What types of goals do I want to achieve? What type of profession do I want to go into? So children are more in a state of, I'm learning for the sake of growing. I'm going to learn and apply these things later in life, not so much right now, but later in life. And adults have more of an immediate need for those things so that they can be self-directing and apply them to their current situation or what they plan on doing pretty quickly in life. Okay? Moving on to Knowles' second concept, which was an adult accumulates a growing reservoir of experience, which is a rich resource for learning. Again, since youth or children don't have that much experience in life, of course, they're still young, they don't know as much as an adult. However, adults have lived a life. They've had a formal education, they've had an informal education, they've had life's experience. So they now have a rich reservoir to draw on in which to use for learning. How do I apply specific learning and learning situations? And adults have that to draw on a lot more than youths have, of course. Looking at Knowles' third concept, which is the readiness of an adult to learn, is closely related to the developmental task of his or her social role. What this means is an adult pretty much wants to learn, what do I have to know for my job? If you're a psychologist, you want to learn things about psychology. If you're a teacher, you want to learn things about teaching. If you're an engineer, you want to learn things related to teaching. You don't want to learn really things that are outside of your realm or your field, or things that don't apply to you, have pretty much no meaning to you, you're not ever going to apply them. So you want the learning to be relevant and they apply to your social role, things that you do in your life that you have a need to know